Unfortunately, it has been driven by interests of the international community, the level of the response that we have seen in East Africa. So when we had initial growings of violent extremism kind of in the underlying, or its roots beginning to show surface in East Africa, there wasn't a lot of attention given to that region. There were a lot of Islamic madrasas being funded by Salafi, Saudi money that has been going on in the 90s and the early 2000s, and people weren't really interested. But of course, after we had seen the rise of Shabab in Somalia, as we see the biggest threat is to the region, that is when you've seen people all of a sudden give attention to Somalia, because of the threat of Al-Qaeda was pretty relevant back in 2008-9 when Shabab was getting to its peak of its influence. And that's when you had people like other East African countries talking about Shabab and comparing them to this violent extremist organization, and saying that there's a real true problem here as far as violent extremism is concerned. And then that's when you had the Americans supporting the Ethiopians, and then later the Kenyans under the AU peacekeeping force, although not necessarily an international community, but it's still an international response to the issue of violent extremism. And more recently, in the EU's migration, or the global migration problem that we've seen, predominantly affecting the EU, now we see funds coming to East Africa with regards to how do you curb migration, but also under the guise of limiting violent extremism and the susceptibility of local populations. The key difference between East Africa and the Middle East is the geopolitics of it. Given the proximity of the Middle East conflict right now to very relevant areas such as Israel and Sahara, the Middle East, and these problems have been going back to the 40s. Naturally, you have a lot more international response. You have a lot more European and global response to it. In East Africa, however, I think the attention, if we were also to consider piracy, for example, which was affecting global trading routes, that's when people started to care. So it's all tied in, right? In this very, very globalized geopolitical world, it's the motivations of what would bring people's attention. And unfortunately, when we see it, that it's coming from a foreign political interest point of the countries that are being involved in these areas, is when you see things usually don't work out so well. With regards to resources and how it should be channeled in order to address violent extremism, it has to be compartmentalized. We need to look at the government and the support to states as very different from the way we're trying to support local communities, and of course from the way we're also trying to empower and help foster the civil society organizations in East Africa. So for example, but then again, further classification is needed, because you cannot compare countries like Somalia to Kenya to Tanzania. As we've seen with the UN PBE action plan, these are epicenter, spillover, and at-risk countries that are facing very, very different problem sets and will need very, very different levels and types of approach. So if you're supporting the government, for example, in Somalia, perhaps a key way to channel resources would be security sector reform. How do you get the security sector to be accountable to the federal government that's trying to be supported by the international community right now? In the case of Kenya, you have it's this biggest spillover country in East Africa, and has the largest attacks from Al-Shabaab. And of course, its forces are there, and now we have this mess where Kenya is threatening to pull out its troops. We're pushing refugees back into Somalia. So how do you help a country like Kenya then? In that case, would be to figure out how to get its populations away from susceptibility to violent extremism. So that would be a lot more development and socioeconomic type of resources, is what I think.